If you have a career, then you have stories to tell, and I want to hear them. Welcome to this episode of CTRL ALT STORY, a podcast where I go through the career journeys of people who work in and with technology, dive into career advice, and share some fun stories along the way. My guest today is Scott Felten. He is a business leader at Incorta. Incorta at a high level is an open data delivery platform used for acquiring, processing, analyzing, and presenting decision-ready data. So definitely want to dive into that a bit more because that's just kind of Googled and got some very high-level information. But yeah, so like I said, just want to kick it over to Scott, let him quickly introduce himself and, initially dive into what it is that he does today at Incorta.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. A business leader at Incorta, everything business development and project management and program management, working with large and small customers, organizing projects, obviously facilitating transactions. Incorta is, we're not a new company, but, we're certainly not as big as IBM. But on the Gartner Magic Quadrant for business analytics, as well as high performance query accelerators. So we get into a lot of big data discussions and stuff like that. So there's a fair amount of technology conversations in the business development and sales conversations that I have.
So let's pretend, it's kind of like explain it like I'm five situation. Someone walks up and says, "What is Incorta?" How would you answer that and describe what Incorta is to that person?
Yeah, so God, that's a great question.
Maybe not five, maybe bump the age up to a little higher.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot of really interesting analogies that you could use. Imagine your job, you were a mover, and your job was to move families from one house to the other. And now imagine that you now are a mover and you have to move 200 families from 200 different houses all into a big apartment building. And you have to figure out how to get all of their furniture and all of their belongings into boxes, and then put those boxes on trucks and drive those trucks to the new apartment building and get all of those things into the right apartments and set them back up so that all of those families, when they go to their new apartment, have a house set up the way they want it to work. Incorta does that for data. It does it for ERPs. It does it for CRMs, customer relationship management, HCM, MES, manufacturing execution systems, etc. We're a data lake company that has two really important things. We have a high performance query engine and data accessibility where we pull all the data from all of your corporate systems into the data lake, stored in standard Parquet. We have direct data mapping technology, which helps us dimensionalize the data, and then we can serve it to your business analytics on the other end. So we're dealing with lots of stuff coming into the data lake, and then we're dealing with lots of reports and charts and graphs and downstream systems like, maybe an analytics system like Cognos, or sending data to a AI workload for Watson X. So yeah, that's, I don't know if that moving company analogy helps at all.
No, that I think that helped paint a great picture. And just to make sure I'm understanding correctly and anyone else understand correctly, when you talk about sitting on top of the data, essentially what you're saying is your data does not have to move from where it's at. You're going to kind of meet the data where it is today, in a sense. Is that correct?
We actually do take a copy of the data. So we are what would be considered a digital mirror. So if your ERP system is over here with all of your data in, I'll get a little techie here, in third normal form, and it's just really difficult to, connect maybe like a BI system all the way back to your Oracle ERP or your SAP ERP or your JD Edwards. And those queries can take a long time and they can be really complex, and there's lots of data there. What we do is we make a copy of that data. But when we make a copy of that data, we keep it exactly as it is in third normal form. We put it in Parquet, and then when we query it, we're querying everything way up in memory. So we're not pulling it off disk. We're not slowing down the production server. So we do actually make a digital copy. So our data lake itself is actually, think of it as a digital mirror of your core ERP, CRM, MES, HCM systems.
That makes sense. Yeah. So I
Yeah.
guess I probably worded my initial question incorrectly. So, but what I was getting at, of course, is that you're not replacing where that data is. But you're still accessing it.
Yes, exactly. A big part of our value proposition for those downstream consumers, maybe somebody in finance, right? Maybe somebody in finance needs to take a look at maybe they're doing an annual revenue forecast or budgeting, planning, forecasting. They're looking at monthly data and they're it's spread out, maybe they're looking at last year and this year and maybe considering what next year might look like. And so they've got the months across the top and all the data kind of, but then they want to dig into a number and they want to say, I want to know why there's this big spike in March. And I want to know what it is in March every year. And so they drill into it and they drill into it. And the problem is that a lot of times that data just goes nowhere because on the way to building that report, maybe it's in a product like IBM TM1, now called Planning Analytics. Um, that data on the way there, we kind of throw data away. We aggregate it in the data warehouse and we aggregate it in the dimensional model. And then we maybe throw a little bit away when we're building the cubes so that we can keep it nice and fast. So when you try to go back to what was the actual record or records in the ERP or in the core financial system that made up that number, you don't really know. So what we do is we don't throw anything away. And so when you write your query, you can go back to the subledger detail for that finance, chart of account line, right? You want to come back and say what made up that expense or where did that revenue come from at the ledger and the subledger detail. Because of the way we build our system, that query can be a sub-second query, which is really phenomenal. But that was one of the core requirements for Incorta is to be able to never throw data away, make sure the data lake contains all the data. And when you want to get back to the data, it is as or much more performant than a fully qualified data warehouse, but at the detailed level that you would get out of an ERP.
And it's my understanding, just from reading, researching different things, a lot of times, data lakes are great. Correct me if I'm wrong, of course. Data lakes are great because they are cheaper, essentially, to run than the data warehouse. But the performance is often where you kind of have that balancing act, right? Like you're not getting performance. So essentially, what we're saying here is you're probably getting the better cost, but you're also
Yep.
getting the increased performance.
Yeah, exactly. And and there are some trade-offs. So if you looked at the value chain of data from, I always tell people, think of an ERP as just a bunch of web forms. When you fill out your credit card details and you're going to go buy something on Amazon, right? You're filling out a form. You're putting in your name and your address, where to send it. You're clicking a few buttons, maybe your credit card, and then you hit submit. Well, an ERP is just a series of forms. A CRM is just a series of forms. Who's your potential customer name? What's their address? What's their bill to address? What's the parts that you're putting in your manufacturing work stream, right? Who are your vendors? Who are your suppliers, etc. And so everything is basically a form. All of that form data goes in, and your entire company, let's say you have 10,000 people in your company, thousands of people are typing in forms all day long and pushing data into ERPs, into, human resource systems, into manufacturing execution systems. All day long, every employee out there is generating data into these forms. The problem is when that data goes into those systems, it's in what we call the third normal form, which is also known as normalized, which means it's really, really good for those systems, but really, really bad and slow and cumbersome to do analytics on it. It's hard to gather up all of the customers and all of the revenue and put those two things together without
Right.
data and analytics in the middle. So you get all of this stuff coming up, and then you have to change it to get it to the analytics. So here's where your cost starts. Your value chain is all that data has to go to analytics. First, you have to access it. So now you have to build connections to all of them. Not too hard. Security is an issue, but you got to make sure they're all good. Those connections have to be fast and efficient. So we can't drag down those systems. So you have to write them well. Now you have to do what we call ELT or ETL, transform that data. And in that transformation, in most situations, what you're going to do is you're going to transform it by aggregating it up. Just
Right.
give me all of the customer names. How many total? how many, et cetera, et cetera. So as we're aggregating revenue and customer and product and SKU and stuff like that, as you move through, you start to lose detail. And all of that work, that ETL work, and then you have to put it into a storage system. And maybe that storage system now, it needs to change a little bit. So you have to do more ETL work to change the storage system or the data warehouse. And then eventually you have to build maybe some data sets that will connect to the data warehouse. And those data sets might have to change. And then eventually you get to a chart or a graph, and then a manager or an executive gets to look at the report and make a decision. That whole value chain gets very, very, very costly. And so a data lake concept, what it does is it says, hey, what if we flipped it on its head? Instead of doing all those transformations and trying to figure out how to group things, we call them subject matters in data warehousing. What if we just put all of the data into the data lake and we made it a little simpler and faster? And what if we had a standard storage format like Parquet? Right now, all of a sudden, you start to go, oh, we can get a lot of data into the data lake really fast. So now you've got all these people producing data. And now you have all that data in a data lake. You're one step closer to the BI. So the data lake gets you one step closer to building those charts and graphs. So in some circumstances, you can put the charts and graphs right against the data lake. But in other circumstances, you might take that data lake data and start doing more ETL up to the data warehouse and summarizing it, or building an OLAP cube for like a planning solution, like a planning analytics, or some other tool downstream. What we do is we actually build that ETL in a dynamic format, and we build it in something called dynamic data mapping. So this DDM concept, right? This direct data mapping. The idea behind it is we store all that metadata virtually. So we don't actually change or throw any of the data away. And because we store it virtually, we actually load those indexes up into memory so that when you do a query from a BI tool, we don't have to go look at these aggregates and rebuild a bunch of queries back to the ERP. We have all of the details, and those queries back are super fast. And so we built our system in such a way that we could kind of, if you want to think of it, avoid all the extra ETL work that goes into building a qualified star schema or Snowflake style data warehouse, which can be brittle, which would then go into maybe an OLAP cube or some other data structure, and then maybe a BI data set at the end, and then finally into a BI report. We take all of those top things out, which means you don't have the labor to build them. They're not brittle anymore because our system is dynamic. And all of those things are going to always be live all the time. So you need to add another dimension. You don't have to unwind your ETL. You just add that dimension to the direct data mapping query. And now all of a sudden it's exposed to the entire BI system. So that's our innovation, is to leverage the data lake concept of putting all the stuff in all at once, and then put that secret sauce on, that direct data mapping, which enables us to avoid the the ETL, the data warehousing, and maybe some of the downstream data modeling like cubes and data sets.
That's fantastic. And you may not realize this, you're kind of speaking my language. I'm having a little bit of a flashback here just because of my days when I was at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Tennessee, and I was in a BI department, and a lot of the struggles that you're describing are things that I was dealing with all the time.
Yeah.
So, and just so I can understand as well, so does Incorta have its own BI component that you can build in, or is it more of it's servicing other platforms, or is it just capable of both?
No, it's a great question. So Incorta is an interesting company. There's a couple of things that I'll say about it. Software's been written for a long time, right? Mainframes, IBM, good institutional company. There's still code out there for mainframes. It's still a viable platform. It's still being used. Most of the BI revolution happened in the late 90s, right? And so Cognos, which eventually got acquired by IBM, there's still, even though Cognos is a great system, there's still legacy code, and it still thinks about things from this older style of pull data out and put it in a data structure like a data warehouse. The Kimball stuff all kind of came up in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And so there's a generational situation. If you look at Incorta is a relatively recent company. Incorta was the core code base was built on big data and cloud. And so the big data revolution, we used to call it Hadoop and stuff like that, was really built on the backs of the social media companies, Facebook and Yahoo and LinkedIn and Google, right? They were producing all of this massive amounts of data, just like all the data that I was talking about, the enterprise data. And all of the traditional BI systems were falling down. They couldn't handle it. So they built this concept called big data, Hadoop, which is one of the bases of where Parquet comes from, this file system based data structure. And we standard on Parquet as an industry, but Incorta is built on top of that big data revolution technology shift away from the data warehouse and into this idea that we put all the data in a lake. We started calling it a lake at some point as opposed to a Hadoop cluster, but we put it in the lake and then we write our queries against the lake. And so it's a very different model than the data warehousing model. So you want to think of it as Incorta is built on top of this big data concept. And then of course it's in the cloud. And then we have a couple other big advantages. Virtualized cluster management, containerization, Kubernetes, orchestration, all of these terminologies are all very cloud native, right? And they're about loading everything up into memory so you can serve it super fast. So we're not going down to disk all the time to look for the data. It's already sitting there right away. So when you write a query against it, it's super fast. So the punchline to this is, what is Incorta? Incorta is a unified data and analytics platform, or what we call a UDAP. And so Gartner has a quadrant for business analytics, and we fit in that UDAP category, which is we access data from all of your corporate data systems. We load it into a data lake in a concept called ELT, extract, load, and transform. And then we put our secret sauce, our direct data mapping on top of it. And then we leverage this high performance query accelerator. And so we're on 2 Gartner Magic Quadrants, one for data and analytics and one for high performance query accelerators. And so the whole system together kind of works. It's a one-stop shop for all your analytics, but it can handle lots and lots of large data. It's also very flexible and an open format. So you can maybe bring your data into the data lake, and maybe you don't serve it in Incorta analytics and dashboards. Maybe you send it to Cognos, or maybe Power BI, or maybe Workday Adaptive, or maybe IBM Planning Analytics, or maybe IBM Watson. And so when we bring our data through our data lake and we put our direct data mapping technology on top of it, what we effectively do is we expose a flattened view of our data. And I write a newsletter, a little blurb here. I write a newsletter called Flat Data, which is all of those downstream tools, whether it's planning analytics or IBM analytics, business analytics, the old Cognos platform, any AI workloads, whether they're written on, in Python or whatever, planning models, Workday Adaptive, maybe OneStream, maybe Blackline, consolidation tools, they all really like to consume data in its flattened format. They do not like to consume data in its third normal form format. So by bringing the data into our data lake, we automatically provide a flattened view. So we can actually become a downstream service provider to all of those systems. So sometimes you use our entire platform and get all our charts and graphs here. And sometimes you take some of those views of data and you send that same data out to a consolidation tool or a planning tool or another BI tool, another corporate BI tool.
And yeah, I want to. It's like I'm struggling internally because I want to move on, ask you other questions, but I also want to learn more about Incorta because I'm very intrigued. I'm very interested. I want to ask one more. And I may ask more, so I may lie, but at least want to ask one more question. All right. So let's say I am a Cognos developer,
Sure.
and we have Incorta, the company I work for. when I'm considering, let's say I'm in a world without Incorta, right?
Uh-huh.
And you have this data in third normal form. So if there's a situation where, let's say, that data is across multiple database types, so we have some data in SQL Server, some data is in Oracle, some
Some
data
is
is
on the
maybe in
file, but
cloud.
yeah,
Yeah,
some might
where
be in PDFs. Yep.
right. So just so so I'm clear, anyone listening is clear. When it comes into Incorta, we don't care anymore from like a Cognos or a Tableau, Power BI, whatever perspective.
Yep.
We're able to pull that data together
Just
regardless.
tables. It's just yep. It's just think of it as dimensions and measures. It's ready for consumption. You don't have to think about what format if the old maybe there's 7 ERPs in a company because they've acquired a few different firms over the years, and maybe one of them is running off an old AS400, and maybe one's a cloud system, right? And maybe one is, a more modern, like an SAP or an Oracle or right, like a Fusion or something like that. When it gets into Incorta, it's just one data source. When you query that data, you're querying and joining data just across that one data source.
You're
We're
essentially
an app
querying Incorta. You're not querying
You're
DBT
querying
SQL
in
Server,
Corda
etc.
data, correct? Yeah. And we work with some very large customers, customers I can say the name of. Starbucks is, using Incorda data to serve, to help store managers all over the world understand, how much inventory they have in their baked goods case and in their cases at the end of the day, so that they can start to send out maybe some promotions to folks in their mobile app, and discount some of their perishables so that they don't have wastage, right? That data set is an enormous data set, and it's being
Imagine.
sent out to this entire organization, and it crosses many different areas inside of Starbucks. But those reports are going out all the time. So that's the power of its big data origin, is that we can do these small individual use cases that get fed by these enormous data sources across multiple different types of data.
And okay, I have one more question.
Oh yeah.
So, you're talking about data lakes, we're talking about data warehouses. There is, of course, the concept of the data lake house as well.
Yep.
So I just kind of wanted to see, just in general, what is your thought about the data lake house idea?
Yeah, so I'm probably not your average business development bear. So I'm gonna throw some techie terms in here. So the idea of a lake house is, the whole idea of it is it's kind of a SQL-based structure. A data warehouse is a SQL-based structure. What it does is it takes that data that is hard to work on because it's in these weird table formats. And it puts it in these nice star schema table formats. Here's the customer dimension. Here's the product dimension, right? Here's revenue measures and facts, as we call them. And so that's the way we build a data warehouse. Well, the functionality that you need to build that data warehouse is ETL, and it's usually written in SQL. And that SQL has to be ACID transaction compliant, which basically means, it's a way of grabbing the data and putting it somewhere where all the handshakes are in place so that data can't get lost en route. And nothing can happen until the data lands in its eventual place. ACID transactions themselves, ACID support, is fundamental for being able to build something called a delta table. And a delta table is an underpinning of a modern data lakehouse. So you might hear some other folks like maybe Databricks talk about, their delta format. We actually came up with the delta format before they started talking about it very early on. It was in our development stream where we were building the early versions of ACID transaction support at the Parquet level for these delta tables. So we have full delta support, full delta transaction support. So if you wanted to, you could literally build a traditional Kimball star schema in our data lake, leveraging this concept of a lake house architecture and the specific technical functionality of those delta tables themselves.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you for that. So I
Sorry, I
do.
went a little deep there.
No, you're good. You're good. I kept kind of pushing you and pushing you to keep going deeper because I'm just like anyone listening to this. I'm learning a lot as well. So let's, we know, now we know who you are, we know what you do today, we know, all about Incorta. So I would like to kind of go back in time. We don't have to necessarily go through every single thing, but just kind of want to paint the picture of your career, leading up to this point, kind of where you started and maybe some of the interesting highlights along the way.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually didn't I took a few tech classes in college, but I wasn't really planning on becoming a technologist. I thought I was going to be a geology teacher, actually, and I was studying social science. But I did take a few classes, and I had when I was in college, I had a problem, and it was in the 90s, and I had an old 286 computer at home with a KXP printer, a dot matrix printer, and I couldn't get the printer to work to print out my papers for my geology class. So I went into the computer lab at the college where you were able to type your papers, and I asked them if they could help me out. And the guy gave me a disk. He kind of looked at me and he gave me a disk and he goes, "You need a driver for your printer." And he just handed me this floppy disk, right? And I said, "Okay." He said, "Bring it back when you're done with it." So, okay. So I went home. I didn't know what to do with it. I figured it out one thing at a time, looking up instructions, etc. Figured out how to load the driver, got the printer working late at night, printed out my paper, brought it back in the next day, had my paper in one hand and the disk in the other. And I hand the disk to the guy and I said, "Here's your disk back." And he's like, "You got it to work?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I got my paper right here. I'm going to turn it in." He said, "You want a job?" And that's when I realized it was in that moment I was like, oh, wait a second. Not everybody likes solving technical problems. And I had a lot of fun the night before, even though I had to stay up late. I didn't think it was a problem. I didn't think it was a challenge. I thought it was one of the best nights I'd had in years. I was just like, I really enjoyed solving the technical problem. Every time there was some new command to type in, I was excited to type it in and see if it worked. And I think that was really instrumental. And so I didn't go right into technology at the beginning. But what wound up happening is, as I was leaving school, and I had worked for this guy now for a couple of years running his computer lab, actually, and I had learned how to build a document conversion tool. I built their first intranet website for the social science department. So I'd started dipping my toes into technology and development and stuff, but I still was not really going out to get a tech job. And he mentioned me, he said, if you ever want a job in tech, the guys down at Symantec, Norton Antivirus Company, are always hiring. So I kept it in the back of my head. Um, and yeah, so that's kind of how I got started. And then, one thing after another, there was just all of these stories that over those first few years at Symantec and then my career afterwards that pop up that all have that same theme, which is, you know, I like broken computers. I like technology problems. I like hard problems to solve because it's fun to solve them. And I've been lucky enough, I think, to find a way to make a career out of it.
It reminds me a little bit of when I made the career. So my very first semester in college, I was a communications major, and my thought was I'm going to work for a newspaper, which thank God I didn't pursue that. So that's what I had in my head, right? So I do one semester, and then near the end, I'm like, you know what? I'm here at this college, and I'm on a computer. I go home, I'm on my computer. I was like, you know what? I might as well get paid to be sitting on a computer. I'm doing it anyways.
Yeah.
And that's when I changed my major to computer programming. So not
You know,
exactly the same, but made me think of it.
it's interesting. We were talking about big data. I've been interested in big data since the very beginning. So when I first got my first tech job was on the customer support line actually at Norton Antivirus. And we had this problem. There were these things called internet worms. So I started there in 2000, and internet worms are all the rage, right? Like the I love you virus and stuff like that. Well, there was this one. It was called MTX, And MTX, what it would do is it would infect your Windows computer and make it almost impossible to start. And if it did start, it just basically wouldn't work. And it was a type of virus called polymorphic, which means you couldn't just go find the file and delete it. It would create another version of itself. So you had to remove it in DOS. You had to clean boot your computer all the way to power off and then boot it up and catch it in DOS before it got into Windows. This was back in the olden days. And so that was really difficult because I was on the phone and I had to walk a customer through like 40 minutes of DOS commands to find that infected file and figure out which one it was and delete the infected file and then restart. And hopefully you would hear that little, the tone from Windows starting up. And we're like, okay, we got it. There were so many calls hitting our call center. At the time, we had, I think, some 15, 20 million users installed. There were so many calls coming into our call center with 300 employees in the call center that we couldn't even measure the number of busy signals hitting the phone trunk at the local trunk. And we went to the Denver trunk for the whole Western US. They had so many calls they couldn't measure it. It topped out. It went over the top of their reports. So I figured something out. All of my instructions that I had to give the customer to type, which they would regularly make mistakes, they were all in DOS. And I thought, I wonder if I could automate them in a batch file. I'd never written a batch file before. I'd never really, I'd done a little bit of stuff in college, but nothing. And so after my shift, I stayed up again all night long and I wrote a batch file with every one of those commands. And we had this inert virus for testing that we could use. And I inertly affected a computer and I programmed it and it removed the entire thing automatically. And at first it ran for an hour and then I eventually I had to learn how to use a RAM disk. And I got that to work. And now all of a sudden the thing was running in 30 seconds. And I went to, it was still at work when the Monday team came in and I went and talked to my manager and I said, I'm holding up another disk and I said, I figured it out. I can remove the MTX virus in 30 seconds with the program on this disk. And they're like, what are you talking about? So a couple of weeks went by and we figured out how to, get, this disk, the file to the end users. We started charging for the service and one thing led to another. And we created the first virus removal service in all of the antivirus companies. And we were the first profit center in all of the customer support, the consumer customer support, and we made $1 million that year.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's a crazy story.
Yeah. So and it was all based on this big data concept. We had another interesting story. Same group, a couple years later. I was the dev manager for the web team and the knowledge base team and the reporting team. So I had all three of these teams were kind of under me. And the web team, what would happen is customers would, we had one of the very first little, when an error message pops up on your computer and you could click a link and it would bring you to a website to tell you what the problem was. We had one of the very first versions of that. And what it would do is when the error message would pop up, we would look at like the language and the region and the error code, and we would get a little bit of, 5 or 10 parameters, and we would put them on the query line. So when it went up to our little Perl script and, we would log it and we would log it to a database. And what we would use that for is when we wrote a knowledge base article, we would send the customer automatically there. They get an error message, they click the link, they go straight to the support article. That's great for everybody. They get their problem answered quickly, no searching, no nothing. They don't have to call us. We don't have to pay for the phone call. Great. Problem is that anything that didn't match went to something called doc not found. So that would enormous numbers. One weekend, again, I seem to do all this work on the weekends and the evenings. One weekend, I decided to load the data into a SQL database because I wanted to run some queries on it to give the knowledge base writers the top things to write going forward. So I thought, I'm going to load this into a SQL database. It'll make it easier for me to scrub this once a week when I have to give them new assignments. And I see this anomaly in my query. It's ridiculously high. It's thousands of times higher than any of the other error codes. I'm like, what is this thing? So the next week I ask some people about what's going on. And eventually I find out that the error code is a general error code for install error. It just means the install failed. And I'm like, well, how can that many, it's got to be wrong. How can that many installs be failing? And at the time we had, about 20 million users, installed. Every laptop, every computer you bought at any store would have Norton antivirus installed on it, so it would try to install itself. And I'm like, God, I guess it's possible we have that many. I mean, we were clocking at 20,000 an hour, like ridiculous number of failed installs. This is terrible. So I talked to the product team and I finally got somebody to listen and they said, we'll research it. Your data's got to be wrong, but we'll research it. They came back and they found out that the people who worked on the install script module, right, install shield module, had no dev manager over them. They had 3 skip levels. It was like a VP was the closest manager. And everybody on that team were new grads. No senior developers, no junior developers. They were all grads. They took all of the grads that came into the company and put them on that team. And nobody knew what they were doing. And it had been that way for over a year. So their code was a complete mess. They fixed the problem in a week. They put some senior developers on there. They fixed the problem in a week. The error count went down, and that next year we won an award for customer satisfaction. So like that big data problem, that data at scale, that collecting the data, all hinged on that one thing, which is chase the, kind of pull the thread. And time after time, I look at all of these stories across my career, and the things that were really impactful were these things where I was like, I just need to figure out the answer to that. The chasing the answer led to, in a couple instances, into some big effects downstream.
So we have you, obviously loved computers, loved solving problems. Obviously, even at this point in time, you're starting to show an aptitude for leadership, solving problems. So how do we, how is it that we go from there to now I'm business leader at Incorta? What's kind of the transition there from going to more, let's say, a developer type role, if you will, a little more hands-on versus, what you do today? Like, what's that quickly, not like every single job, because I've looked, obviously I looked at your LinkedIn. There's a lot of information out
There's a
there,
lot of jobs
but
in there.
yeah, very impressive resume. But just describe that career
Yeah,
progression.
yeah, I think to be quite honest, there's especially in large organizations, I was with that organization for about 12 years and I did a lot of different things. And as things changed, there's always this gap, there's this vacuum, right? When things are changing, a lot of people just kind of wait to hear what they should do next. And I think I step forward and say, well, what's broken here? How can we fix something? How can we build the bridge to where we're going? I don't know if maybe that's, me being a little overconfident. I probably get myself into trouble doing it. But, time and time again, we had a big outsourcing where a number of people, about 300 people we moved the support organization to a new company. And all of these people were going to leave their jobs here and go to their new jobs at this new company. But the problem was nobody could sort out the 300 people and who were the supervisors and who were this and who were that. And so I was given a huge spreadsheet with 300 to 400 people on it, and it had some data on it. And I was like, I've got like 2 days to figure out how to solve a problem of where are people going to go. And I started looking at Visio. I don't know why, but I'm like, if I could just build an org chart, and I found a little function, a little feature in Visio that allowed me to import that spreadsheet and automatically built me an org chart, right? If I wouldn't have just kept pushing on it, I think I wouldn't have found that one thing. That org chart was the thing that really helped that organization move. And time again, we would run into these technical problems, and I would continue to have that kind of that response to it, which is how do I solve the problem? So when I moved on from my career in the big company, I started doing consulting, which was kind of obvious. And consultants are out there trying to find and solve problems with technology, and I did a lot of work with IBM Cognos, planning analytics, what used to be called TM1. I built advisory services, BI Center of Excellences, and every time I moved to a new organization, whether it was a new consultancy or, um, you know, uh, I ran a startup for about 5 years that would build a lineage, an automated lineage based on TM1. Um, all of those, I guess, career moves, they all had that same concept, which is try to find the problem and move towards it, right? Don't shy away from the problem. Don't wait for somebody to tell you how to solve the problem. Attack the problem, right? And really focus on it. Now believe that everything is possible in technology. It's just code, it's just time, it's just resources, maybe just another 30 minutes of really trying to struggle with this problem, you might crack
Just
the
another
code.
weekend, just another late night on a weekend. That's all you
Yeah,
need,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. You got to take some breaks from that from time to time, but and I'll tell you what, my career trajectory started, from now all of a sudden I was flying to different places. And now all of a sudden they were bringing me to the Bulls game to do the big speech for the people before they were going to watch the game about advanced threat protection or something like that. When I was running the startup, I was traveling the world and, building a partner network for 50, partners across the globe to use our software and following the IBM folks across, around the world. And so it's not all hard work. I mean, there were a few Michelin star restaurants in there from time to time and some mountain biking in New Zealand and maybe a little bit of time on, the beach in Australia. So yeah, it's not all hard work. There's been some good times.
Yeah, so what we're saying is, we can go from the guy with the floppy disk who doesn't know how to fix his printer to the guy on the beach in Australia. Like it's
Yes,
possible. It's possible.
exactly, exactly.
So, we have a little bit of history here, kind of how the world was as far as in the world of technology, how it was, when you guys started, and we talked about what you're doing today, talk about what we're doing, what you're doing in Corda, all the amazing things there. So when you think about the world of, BI and analytics, what do you see evolving over the next 5 to 10 years? Like I know obviously AI is on everyone's mind right now, but just,
Sure.
that's a loaded question, I get, but kind of what are your thoughts on the next couple of years?
Yeah, I learned early on, even in that early job where I was the analytics manager, back in the mid 2000s. I learned early on that business analytics and BI was about um, learning how to ask, kind of doing what you're doing, learning how to create a space where you can ask questions and give answers, and then worry about the technology second. Because a great question and a couple of great answers to that question they're the fundamentals of great software, of a great solution, of a great service. And as I've gone through my career, that questioning and answering becomes more and more important. I was trained as a business analyst, was trained as a project manager, did a PMI Institute, all that kind of stuff. All of it, all of it centered on this idea that there's something going on underneath the covers. And I think that as I started hearing about AI, the current version of generative AI, I was very interested in big data and analytics early on. And I thought that big data was going to, with my exposure to BI and how companies used it, and especially how we used it early with machine learning and trying to understand the massive numbers of viruses and advanced threat detection and anomaly detection. I know that IBM has a position in the security world as well, that machine learning really required that big data. So I was always kind of thinking about it. And as early as I think GPT 2.5, I was starting to get interested in OpenAI and the work that they were doing. And I finally got my developer invite, I think it was to 3.0. And I started playing with it and taught myself a little Python to be able to work with it. And I was fascinated. I was absolutely fascinated. And the reason I was fascinated is because what I realized right away is that this was going to allow us to tell stories. It was going to allow us to ask questions, understand, get a lot of answer candidates, is what I'll call them, and really start to build stories, really start to build these kind of options. And as we went to 3.5, I was telling all my friends, you guys have to pay attention to this thing. It's getting good. Like the next version of this, if they keep going, like we're looking at real AI. And then, of course, the ChatGPT moment happened for everyone. And people started going, oh, wow. Like you can just talk to this thing. You can ask it a question and it will give you an answer. So as I think about that as the backdrop, what does the next 5 to 10 years look like? I think we all stop becoming plumbers and electricians inside the computers and the computer code. And we all start migrating a little bit more towards storytelling. And I think we have to start to ask ourselves, what is the creative story? What would happen if we did this with the business? What would happen if we were a manufacturing company? What would happen if we created a direct-to-consumer product? What kind of products would our customers want? What would our market be? Could our people use their expertise and their background, their stories to bring to bear in combination with the generative AI that gives you kind of a staff of experts to help you bring the answers to bear to tell a new story? And I think that we're going to start to have this like pipeline built on individual creativity is going to translate into the raw materials that AI will help us turn into, at least in the business context. I think it'll help us turn it into new business models and new business opportunities for large companies and for small companies. It's easier than ever to start a small business, right? But it's also easier than ever to be in a company with 10,000 employees and stand out. Because now all of a sudden, you might be a grade 2 developer, but you could build the next Gmail in like a week with ChatGPT. So we're in a revolutionary time, and I think the only thing that we need as to focus on is where do the raw materials for those stories come from? And I think the raw materials come from people. They come from their backgrounds, their subject matter expertise, their life experience. And if they learn how to use tools like watsonx built on their corporate data, Incorta sits on top of Oracle or SAP, and you want to start to look at that data together, use our Copilot, you start to get this sense of the only thing I'm being held back by is our imagination. So I think we're going to see a massive business expansion based on personal creativity being translated through AI into new business opportunities.
I think that's a great answer. So I do want to be respectful of your time. I know we're coming up on our scheduled time, and I know you're a very busy man. You probably had 12 meetings already before you talk with me today, and you probably have 50 more after that. So I do want to be respectful of that time. I want to at least ask you one more question, and this is a little more lighthearted, a little more off the wall. Feel free to tell me, no, I don't want to answer that. All right, so you get a call today.
Yep.
It's someone from the bad Grim Reaper side of HR. Not everybody's in HR is bad, but that person. So you're in trouble for something. It's crazy. And obviously this is just imaginative. This is nothing you've actually done, but you get in trouble. What is it? What is it just based on your personality? What'd you do?
Trouble for?
We're not admitting to anything. So anyone listening, this is not a confession.
It's a good question because there's two things around HR, because I've had a lot of jobs, and most of them I chose to move to the next thing because I was interested in something new. But there are a few times where the job that I was working on came to an end. There wasn't anything for me to do there that I was interested in, and it was time for me to leave. I've always seen job transitions as a huge opportunity, because every time you change, you get an opportunity to reinvent and to do something new. I'm trying to think of what would it be? What would it be? I don't know.
For me, if I think about myself, I'd be like, okay, I probably told a joke that I thought was really funny, and someone was like, that is the dumbest joke, and I'm so offended, even though that was not my intention.
I got it. I figured it out. Here's what would happen. They would say, listen, we think you're great, Scott. You do all these conferences, you go to Las Vegas, you're great with our customers, all of this stuff. But, you know, you're just not allowed to take a group of our customers and prospects to Area 51 and try to storm the fence. It's just we got in a lot of trouble for that. Yeah, I know you were really into aliens and you really think they're real and all that, but you just can't bring that to work. That's got to be a personal thing. I could see that happening.
That's an amazing answer, and that it makes me wish I was one of your clients because I, just so I could join in on the fun. All right. So, like I said, I do want to be respectful of your time, but I want to give you an opportunity. If there's anything, you didn't get to say, anything you didn't get to cover, or any just closing statements, anything like that, just kind of want to open up the floor for anything you want to, even a last
Well,
minute pitch.
yeah, no, certainly. And I'd love to have another conversation or a further conversation after the recording's done. But I'm curious. I'm a very curious person. Um, I'm curious what you think the next, and I won't give you 5 to 10 years, but I'll just say the next 1 to 3 years. I mean, you're working for one of the premier AI companies in the world, legacy of innovation. It's a market making company. I have been in and around. I've sold IBM software through them acquiring a lot of their AI stuff. In the past, I'm very familiar with Watson. I was a big fan of the Jeopardy stuff. I know a little bit about the tech behind it. Especially from an IBM standpoint, like, what's your insider view of what the next year or 2 or 3 looks like?
That's a great question. And, obviously I'm usually thinking of the questions to ask, not the, not the questions to answer.
Put you on the spot here.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, to me, I really think about a lot of existing products
Yeah.
that just can be taken, the ones that they're solid products as they are today, but just enhanced and made, so much better. So just from
Mhm.
from an IBM product perspective, I mean, and we're already seeing that to some extent. We're seeing like with we were talking about Cognos, for example. Cognos
Mhm.
has natural language AI assistant that's built in now, and
Mhm.
that's improving it was introduced a long time ago, but now that's even getting even better.
Mhm.
So I think of it from that perspective. I do see IBM having a huge role as far as open community of models, people
Mhm.
designing models, collaborating on large language models. I think that's something they've really stressed a lot, and I think that's going to continue to grow and evolve. Really, just the open community around let's make models that are for business purposes. Like ChatGPT is great. Their models are great, but when you think about it from a business perspective, it doesn't make quite as much sense.
Right.
For as far as you don't need Reddit posts and all this stuff
Sure.
behind the
Sure.
scenes feeding into your business answers, right? So I think about that. Yeah, it's a really good question, and I just really think about a lot of ways to just make life easier for people who are doing mundane day-to-day tasks. Essentially like a assistant, if you will, sitting on your shoulder who's helping you with whatever the task is. And we're seeing that today, but I do think that's going to just continue to grow, especially when you think about the idea of combining AI and automation together. So not only is it telling me, let's say here's a recommendation for what to type, but it's gonna do the tasks for me as well, and then
Mhm.
give me some kind of
Mhm.
return as well. So that's kind of where my brain goes. But if I sat here and thought, I'd come up with a lot of other answers if I thought about it more.
Well, it's interesting nonetheless, though. Hey, thanks so much for inviting me to do this, and I like telling old stories, and yeah, I wish you all the success in your podcast.
Oh, I really appreciate it. Thanks for being willing to jump on there. I'm trying to branch out and not only have people from IBM, so I really appreciate you jumping in here. And I mean, I was excited because I wanted to learn more about your career. I want to learn more about Incorta, and uh, my plan going into it was I had a couple different things, but then you start talking about Incorta, and I was just very interested. It was speaking to a
Yeah,
lot of things I've dealt with in my life, so that's why I kept diving in. But I don't regret that one bit. But yeah, definitely appreciate it. And maybe we'll have a part two sometime and pick up some different topics and deep dive into those as well.
awesome. Well, from the Incorta perspective, I'll say that Incorta thinks very highly and respects IBM, and sending data through our data lake to the IBM solutions is a big part of our business. And yeah, we feel we're at least cousins. So
Absolutely. Not cousins removed, just
yeah,
regular
yeah,
cousins, right?
first cousins.
All right. Well, I definitely appreciate you having on. Appreciate you having you on here, and I'm gonna go ahead and stop this recording. And till next time.
All right, awesome, great.
Thank you for checking out this episode of Control Alt Story. My name is Josh Spurgeon, and I'm a watsonx technical specialist at IBM. I can also be found under the name Data Nerd Josh on various social media platforms such as YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn.